You're listening to Sasquatch Syndicate.
911, what are you reporting?
We got someone or something crawling around out here.
Did you see what it was? Was it a person or an animal or?
I can't tell. All I know is that my central light came on and I just happened to glimpse and see this thing running across the yard.
And all the ape believers don't want any of the paranormal believers to say anything because they're all whacked and screwed up and we don't want them. And all the paranormal believers don't want to go to the ape believers saying, well, you're all closed-minded. You're not open to the fact that it does this and it does that.
And I look over my left shoulder and this creature is running through the woods and it's bulldozing the brush down. And I knew, man, this thing is going to get me.
Welcome to Sasquatch Syndicate. I'm your host, Chuck, out in Seattle, Washington, along with Paul in Portland, Oregon. Thanks to everyone for listening and those following us at SasquatchSyndicate.com and on our social media outlets. For those participating in the Sasquatch Syndicate monthly t-shirt giveaway, this month's winner was Mel Clifton from Surrey, British Columbia. So Mel, thanks for listening to the show, and please check your Facebook for winner notification. Happy Halloween, everyone. We hope you had a great October. And for those that made it out to the first annual Alien Con and had a chance to stop by our exhibit and panel discussion, I just wanted to say it was great to meet you. We really had an amazing time celebrating the Halloween festivities with everyone, so thanks again for stopping by. A couple of quick announcements before we get into this month's podcast. Sasquatch Summit will be held November 18th through 20th at the Quinault Hotel and Casino in Ocean Shores, Washington. You can buy tickets at SasquatchSummit.com. So for those that are able to make it out to the conference, we will have a booth there, so please stop by and say hello. We really look forward to meeting you. So on to this month's podcast. With us on tonight's episode is Eric Penz. Eric is the best-selling author of the book Cryptid, The Lost Legacy of Lewis and Clark. Cryptid was part of the Sasquatch Syndicate book club back in August. So for those unaware, Sasquatch Syndicate typically recommends a book each month. You can find that under Sasquatch Syndicate, under Home, and then Book Club. So Eric, welcome to Sasquatch Syndicate, and if you wouldn't mind sharing your background on Sasquatch or Bigfoot prior to your research and, of course, casting this creature in your best-selling thriller.
Well, I'd say I didn't, when I began writing this novel, have much of an understanding or awareness or any background in Sasquatch or any related cryptozoological phenomenon. When I started writing this novel, I was trying to write a Jaws meets Jaws in the backwoods kind of a monster story. But I was trying to figure out what monster I wanted to put in the backwoods. I didn't want to have something like a grizzly bear or some other animal that was well known. And I didn't want to create something too fantastic that became unbelievable. One of the things about writing thrillers is the more real the monster is, the scarier it is, which is why a movie like Jaws was such a successful thriller, because everybody could believe in somewhat that a shark could do that. So I had to come up with something that was within the realm of possibility. Then I began doing some research, and I lived in the Northwest all my life. And I'd always heard stories of Bigfoot and Sasquatch. Never really had done any homework on it. So I said, hey, let's take a look at this legend, if you will. There are not a lot of monster legends in the Northwest to consider. So I spent about a year doing nothing but learning and reading and talking to anyone who had any knowledge about the subject to understand whether this was something that would fit in my novel. The thing that came from that is I found that not only would it fit, but it was like a perfect fit. It was exactly what I wanted for this piece of fiction.
So Eric, as you kind of went down this path of research and dove kind of headfirst into the subculture around purported experts and eyewitness encounters and stories and tales, what did you learn along the way?
One of the things, there's a lot of things that surprised me about it. First of all, I realized quickly that it wasn't a regional phenomenon. I traveled to Texas, to Pennsylvania, places in between, talking to people that were either eyewitnesses and or people studying and interested in the subject matter So it wasn't just a Northwest phenomenon. In fact, some would say it's a global phenomenon, that there are similar stories, legends, eyewitness accounts in other parts of the world that could be considered related. So that surprised me. I wasn't aware of that. Also, there are some distinct camps within the subculture, if you will. It was interesting for me as I was discussing this with the many people I came across that there's sort of infighting. There's debates about whether Bigfoot is alien or whether Bigfoot is an ape or whether Bigfoot is some sort of a human or hominid. And those camps are rigidly held. They defend their ground. And I was really surprised by that. I'm not sure what the cause of those strong stands that people take is, but definitely there's some emotional charge relating to these different viewpoints, which I respect, but I wasn't expecting it. I mean, that was definitely something that surprised me. And so I'm taking, when I was looking at this from my perspective in terms of the story I'm trying to tell, only certain of those camps were ones that I could reasonably consider for the character of my story, because certain aspects of the varying possibilities fit or didn't fit. And so I ended up gravitating towards those theories or camps that fit what I was trying to accomplish. So I didn't really personally have too much of a horse in the race as to which one I thought it was, although I've come to a position where I probably have an opinion now whereas then I didn't, but I was strictly driven by what fit the story.
So now that you feel like you've formed an opinion, what is your opinion on what this phenomenon and what this creature is?
It's interesting. So on the one hand, the evidence, just objectively, anyone who looks at the evidence, the sheer volume of evidence, which we can include eyewitness accounts, we can include footprints, we can include other samples of hair or other things that maybe have been collected, including historic accounts. The volume of it and the breadth of geography in which this evidence appears would suggest it's highly unlikely that such an animal doesn't exist. I mean, the volume of evidence is just so large. But what is so interesting to me is that the one piece of evidence that would definitively prove that this animal exists or this entity exists is a body or a living specimen. And as hard as people search, this piece of evidence does not exist. And so intellectually, I would tell you that based on the evidence, such an animal has to exist. There's just no other explanation. But yet emotionally, I have a hard time saying that when the one piece of evidence that should eventually show up doesn't ever show up. There's a similar example with the gorilla from, I think it was officially documented in 1902. For years and decades, there were these stories coming out of Africa of this man-like ape or monkey that was big and aggressive, and nobody believed it to be true. Science called it all legend and myth, and it was just the natives down there making stuff up. Until somebody brought back not a living specimen, but bones, physical evidence, and then, of course, science had to accept that it was real. And so it's a very similar situation you have with Sasquatch, but we're in a world where every square foot of the earth has been pretty much explored and trampled and concreted over. So it's hard for the imagination to accept, well, why can't we find something to prove this is real? And that's my opinion is basically it must exist, but emotionally have a hard time acknowledging that fact.
So Eric, as you kind of, jumped into your novel, and I know a lot of it's premised on the Gigantopithecus theory, and of course we know that was a real animal at some time. Of course, we don't know if it was a, bipedal, a quadruped, but we know based on teeth and fossil and even jaw evidence in China that at one point this creature did exist. And it is plausible it could have crossed the land bridge, from Russia into Alaska and down into North America. But what else did you learn along the way, and were you comfortable, kind of typecasting, that creature into your novel?
So I have a degree in biology, and so one of the things that helps my comfort level with telling a story with potentially viable biological creature is because the evidence we have, I should say, has been substantiated. There are not a lot, but there are plenty of fossilized teeth that have been taken out of China and southern Asia that would document a very large ape, much like a gorilla, theoretically, that lived sort of around the time when all mammals on the planet were large. That was back when the mammoths walked the earth, and it was a trend for mammals to be large. And so this was an example of a very large ape. So the theory is that other animals walked across from Asia to North America across a frozen stretch of ice, because the Bering Sea is not very wide, where Alaska and Russia sort of butt up against each other. At one point, or several points in time, that was frozen. You could walk across that. So the theory is that Gigantopithecus could have migrated across from Asia to North America, subsequently going extinct in its home territory of Asia, and now residing only in North America. So that's the essence of the theory, is that Sasquatch or Bigfoot is simply a prehistoric animal that has migrated from one part of the earth to the other part, is currently living in whatever evolved state it currently is, and we've since come to know it or call it Sasquatch or Bigfoot. So there's nothing magical about it, nothing fantastic, nothing supernatural. It's just a species of ape that for some reason is very difficult to corner.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. Of course, we've done a lot of research over the last 10 or 15 years on Gigantopithecus and, why that creature fits the bill. Obviously with any creature, following natural resources or food, or even following mates, could explain the reason why this creature would have left, from Asia, traveling for natural resources, up into Russia, across into Alaska and down into North America. But not really any intelligence behind it.
Yeah, there wasn't, exactly right. There wouldn't have been any intellectual, awareness of where it was and trying to move from one place on the earth to the other. It was simply following the food source or avoiding some other pressures in the environment that caused it to move from one place to another, which, is a documented biological phenomenon for many species. So it's plausible from that perspective. The diets here are different, the food source, the weather's different. Everything in North America is different than where it came from.
Yeah, Eric, as you were researching this topic, of course, for a fictional depiction of this phenomenon, what did it feel like to see the dots start connecting themselves and actually turning into something more than myth?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because honestly, when I began this project, I truly thought that it was a legend, it was myth, it was nothing real that I was investigating, right? I was just exploring some, like the boogeyman, something that we all know isn't real, but it's kind of fun to talk about. But that's kind of what sucked me into the subject matter, was that as I dug deeper, I realized there is some real meat to this. There is, not only from just hard data, but the human element. There were so many people that I talked to who unofficially, would talk to me. They hadn't made any formal statements to anyone that I was aware of who would tell me their story. And it was shocking to me how valid the story, these are current eyewitness accounts of people that were friends and family, people I had known who didn't acknowledge this to me before. But one of the themes in my story is what I call the human blind spot, that humans have a tendency to not see facts that are in direct conflict with their own belief about themselves and their world. And I think that there's some validity here to us humans having a blind spot to something like Sasquatch, because it threatens our uniqueness in the natural world, one way or another. If there's another species or entity that is intelligent, that walks upright, that looks kind of like us, somehow we're no longer the unique, special species that we have thought ourselves to be. And for me, it was like my blind spot. I recognized my blind spot. Like, oh, why did I not see this before?
It's really interesting that you say that blind spot. I know Tom Powell has a book out, The Edges of Science, and he talks about actually to see Bigfoot, you've got to believe. Because without some sense of belief, you may see something in the woods and have no frame of reference as it relates to where to put that, right?
Right.
But as soon as that worm gets in your head, you start seeing possibilities, and yeah, that's really interesting that you say that.
Yeah, I find it something that's been prevalent wherever I go. No matter who I talk to, it seems like there are some people who have the blind spot and some people who don't. And it may be something just born into us that we are more or less skeptical than some people and don't have the capability to see it. I'm not quite sure. I put my finger on the cause, but there's definitely a distinct difference from person to person on how they approach the subject.
Earlier I asked you, Eric, about, what is your thought on what this creature is? And I'm not sure if I got the answer to that.
For the purposes of my story in particular, it was very much like an animal such as the gorilla or a grizzly bear or some key top of the food chain species, something that is in control of its environment, that doesn't really isn't really threatened by other forces or species in its habitat, that it was kind of in control. It doesn't really have a natural bent towards violence or aggression, but like many species, under certain circumstances, it can. And in the story, I bring out this element in the sense that within my story, it's a species of animal that is basically going extinct because the U.S. government has been hunting it into extinction ever since Lewis and Clark discovered it. And it's feeling this, like any animal would when it backs against a corner, this pressure, the stress of that process. And due to that stress, in the self-preservation mode, it acts very aggressively under the right circumstances. And I think my personal opinion is that that's probably not too far from what such an animal could be experiencing. I can imagine that it would be stressed as its habitat is shrinking, as resources are shifting and adjusting, and its life as it has been historically must be different. So not that it would be normally bent towards aggression, but I can imagine it being stressed, and therefore sometimes that stress comes out in a more aggressive behavior. That's how I see it. But in terms of what it actually is, your guess is as good as mine. But I think because I have a biologic education, scientific education, I have a tendency to want to, or at least it's more comfortable for me to align myself with a non-hominid animal camp. Maybe some hybrid between an ape and a human, but definitely I don't see it as an alien. I don't see it as a supernatural. I see it as an animal that's yet documented by science, in my opinion.
So Eric, kind of going back to Lewis and Clark, I know that, a lot of your storylines based on that expedition, and there actually are articles where Lewis and Clark on separate occasions kind of describe these creatures as large men without moccasins. And I also think at one point they kind of described them as resembling bears with large feet. So I'm just curious, did you do a lot of research on Lewis and Clark, and did you find any of that along the way?
I was pretty deep into the project before the whole Lewis and Clark connection developed. I was kind of, from a storytelling perspective, I was at a dead end. I couldn't quite make the story work like I wanted to, and I couldn't figure out what I was missing. I remember one night I was up late pacing around in my living room trying to figure out what the solution was. And it just so happened that I was reading the book Undaunted Courage at the time, which, if you're familiar with that book, Stephen Ambrose is a historian, fabulous narrator. He was telling the story of Lewis and Clark's expedition, but from the perspective that it was not so much a scientific endeavor, but a military endeavor, that it was the U.S. government conquering the continent through the guise of scientific expedition, but definitely emphasizing the human endeavor that it was. Anyway, so I was reading this book at the same time I'm going through this challenge, and I was thinking to myself, what? So if I try to ground Sasquatch in history, something that is part of Earth's history, what would be the first time it would be documented? Who would be somebody who could have documented it that nobody would question? It just came to me that, well, obviously nobody would, if Lewis and Clark had discovered Sasquatch and described it in his journals, we wouldn't be having these conversations right now about whether it exists or not. It just would exist. People wouldn't doubt Lewis and Clark. So that took me down this whole path of, okay, so how does that work? How does Lewis and Clark discover it, but we don't see it in the journals that we have today? I then discovered that there are missing segments of Lewis and Clark's journals, and there are whole conspiracy theories around why those holes exist in their journals. And my fictional antennas just were peeing off the hook, and I was like, oh, this is great. This is exactly what I'm looking for. I got all kinds of conspiracies to work with here. So anyway, I started going down this path of researching Lewis and Clark, and found that, like you say, there are entries and commentary from Lewis and Clark about many sort of interesting experiences they had. A lot of it came, though, from just talking with the Native Americans. They had many opportunities to do so. And so they certainly learned about the phenomenon through the Native Americans, although they didn't quite understand it the way we do.
So as you're going through and researching some of these Native American encounters historically, what are some commonalities that you see drawn throughout all of those encounters from the Native Americans?
Yeah, from a bodied evidence perspective, I think this is almost the strongest piece of evidence we have. From location to location, from time period to time period, from Native American nation to Native American nation, there are so much common elements to the phenomenon that it boggles the mind that it can't be real. For example, in the Northwest, simply looking at names, many of the names that the Native American nations gave, if we want to use the word creature or entity throughout time, were very similar. They're very variations of similar words. That's a commonality. The descriptions physically of the entity are very, very common. Some of the variabilities have to do with maybe size, and that tends to be some geographic impact. It seems like the farther east and south you go, the smaller Sasquatch tends to be. The farther west and north you go, like in the Northwest, the larger he tends to be. But that's not unusual even with like mountain lions, for example. The southeastern variety of a mountain lion is smaller than the northwest. So that seems kind of expected. The description of them being hairy and walking on 2 feet and having expressive facial features, those all seem to be very common. They also, though, have a tendency towards describing some sort of, I don't know, this is where maybe the word supernatural comes in. The Sasquatch has some capabilities that we humans have a hard time explaining, that maybe they can spatially move unlike we can, that they can be in one place at one moment and then another place at another moment. In fact, in my story, I use that. The Native Americans can say that they can move, like transport themselves, or there are at least accounts of that. In my story, I use that to explain how they hunt. And in reality, they actually hunt in packs in my story, and they use whistling sounds to confuse their prey to make them look to the prey like they've transported them in multiple places at once, but are actually hunting in packs. But the point is that there are so many commonalities between these Native American traditions that it stretches the imagination that they could have all just spontaneously formed on their own.
Yeah, you were speaking of earlier about the size, and the closer you get to the equator and the warmer it is, the smaller an animal typically will be. And the farther away from the equator in colder climates, the larger the animal will be. I guess there is a algorithm there based upon their surface area and their mass that allows them to actually hold on to heat much better if you have a larger size, which at times would almost seem counterintuitive, right? But and you were speaking about some of those skills, talents, or abilities that the Native Americans would say that Sasquatch has. And I know in some Aboriginal tribes in Australia, they're actually, and it's been studied and proven that the Aboriginal tribes are able to communicate over distances, and I guess I would just say telepathically. As the hunter is coming home from the hunt, they can literally, the village that they're going to can predict his arrival into the village down to the hour. And nobody really knows how they do it, and like you said, they can't really explain it. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's like they have these, I don't know, six senses, or these senses beyond the five that we don't have access to. And I don't actually find it that hard to believe. I may be somewhat of a minority in this camp, but I personally believe that the five senses that we humans connect with and observe the world through is not all of the senses that are possible for some sort of intelligent creature to access. I believe there's got to be more than just these five. And so it does not strike me as impossible that some other creature, some other species, some other entity is able to tap into some other sense that we can't, and communicate and transfer information that way. That does not strike me as impossible.
As you've thought about these, let's call them extra senses, what in your mind might be some of those extra senses that possibly the human race or Sasquatch may have?
I think if you want to call it telepathic, I'm not sure what the word should be, but telepathic is probably understood by most people roughly. I would think that there is some, well, let's just say this. If Sasquatch is real, they have a canny knack for not being discovered. It's kind of like when you're a deer hunter. All year long you see deer everywhere you go. Then as soon as hunting season starts, you can't find a deer to save your life. It's very similar, seems, with Sasquatch. If you're not looking for them, you'll see them. But if you're looking for them, you won't see them. And it could be that they have some sort of not only telepathic capability amongst themselves, but that maybe they can connect with us telepathically without us being aware of it. So that they can sort of read our minds, but they could maybe tap into whatever mental energy we have, like apparently other animals do, like the deer. They seem to know when it's hunting season. So I don't know how you would describe that or quantify that, but it seems like there's some level of communication going on there.
Yeah, almost some
collective consciousness.
Yeah, some intuitive ability to tap into some collective consciousness that we're all tapping into, that you somehow get a read. I've heard that from encounters. People, for example, in the evening, pitch black, but they can see a shadow.
Right.
And definitely see a shadow moving. And the moment they just thought about turning their flashlight on, it just backed off.
And these kinds of abilities, should they be true, would go a long way to explaining why it's been so difficult for us to obtain a specimen, if you will, or have some kind of encounter that we can really document. I also wonder too if you take the whales, for example, how they can communicate over vast distances, with water vibration sound, basically. Many of the Native Americans talk about the whistling that they hear from the Sasquatch, and that is somehow a long-distance communication. So this might still be one of the five senses, but they may be able to tap into those five senses at a heightened level than we can, and, for example, communicate over vast distances through their vocalizations. I don't see that as being all that difficult to accept either.
Yeah, there's a lot of information out there too, around, Sasquatch using infrasound. And, with Sasquatch having, being a bigger animal, having higher lung capacity and a higher tidal volume, similar to an elephant, it could use infrasound to stun its prey or communicate over vast distances. And that, lung power, of course, that whistling kind of sound, of course, at a decibel level that only animals could hear. So I just always find that very interesting.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So getting back to your book, Cryptid, and certainly it's one of Paul and I's favorites, and I highly recommend the folks listening pick that up. And you can pick it up at SasquatchSyndicate.com under book club. But Eric, can you kind of give the audience kind of the author's take and at-a-glance summary of your book?
Yeah, so the novel is titled Cryptid, subtitled The Lost Legacy of Lewis and Clark. And it's a contemporary story, so it takes place today, if you will. It's got a dual timeline, though. There is a underlying timeline during the time of the Lewis and Clark's return from the expedition, but primarily takes place in contemporary time. Essentially, there is a character who is based off of Grover Krantz, actually. Grover Krantz, who was one of the first scientists, if you will, who kind of put his reputation at risk and began to seriously investigate Sasquatch. So this character is based off of Grover, and he has been trying to document Sasquatch's entire career, and to his disappointment, he has had no success. The story starts with him and a prior student investigating the lava tubes in St. Helens. Interestingly enough, there are these lava tubes below Mount St. Helens in Washington State that are called 8 caves because there were a group of folks at the time that it was discovered who were Bigfoot aficionados and were looking for Bigfoot, and they had a club and named after themselves. They called this the 8 Caves. So the story starts with John, this professor, investigating these caves in the St. Helens area because there was a report that maybe there were bones found. Turns out that in the story they do find these bones, but the government had sent out a black ops team to destroy this evidence, and John narrowly escapes. They collapse the caves and destroy the evidence, and John goes on the run. There's a wealthy businessman who is looking for a cure to cancer, and he believes that within the genetics of Sasquatch there is a cure to cancer. So he connects with John to enlist his help to perform an expedition in the Olympic National Forest, or the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, to capture and locate the Sasquatch so that he can do genetic experiments on them. So the bulk of the story takes place in the Olympic National Park, or in the Olympic Peninsula, as this team of scientists go about trying to capture a Sasquatch. Another character by the name of Samantha is an expert on Gigantopithecus. Like John, she is enlisted by Prescott, who is the businessman, to help John capture these Sasquatch that they believe are located in the peninsula. So for the bulk of the book, it is a treasure hunt for not only this specimen, but also the lost journals of Lewis and Clark. Another character is pursuing the history of Lewis and Clark to prove that Sasquatch is real. And like in the vein of, say, a Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, there's a historical treasure hunt looking for these lost journals that will also prove the existence of Sasquatch. Ultimately, they do obtain a specimen, and they take him to a secret lab in the Peninsula where they've been doing experiments on other primates. This is where the wheels come off, things go wrong. The Sasquatch gets loose in the lab and is defending his territory and his family's right to exist, and there's a bit of a manhunt between, you're not sure who's hunting who in the woods, backcountry of the Northwest.
What did you think, like, when you started to see the critics and the other people writing about your book and the reviews? Was it on track with what the message was you were trying to get across?
Oh, good question. Yeah. For the most part, yes. What was interesting is the biggest resistance I received was combining the Lewis and Clark lore with the Sasquatch legends. There's a group of Lewis and Clark patriots, if you will, who take some offense at implying that both Lewis and Clark were discoverers of Sasquatch, and in the story I implied that they were maybe not all that honorable as history shows them. And so from the Lewis and Clark conservatives, if you will, they kind of took offense at that. But again, the story is fiction, which means I can tell whatever story I want to tell, and Lewis and Clark can be whoever I want them to be.
I love it.
Right. But otherwise, from a broad audience, the reviews I received were very positive. And I think one of the things that I accomplished with this is that for the general reading audience who are not Sasquatch aficionados, I think I educated them a great deal, not only about the possibility that such a thing could exist, but gave them an understanding of the facts that exist so that they could maybe make their own conclusions to a certain degree as to what they personally feel. One of the objectives of the story that I eventually came around to was wanting to provide full comprehensive look at the phenomenon so that readers can understand it and not see it, as I did initially, as just this boogeyman legend that I've heard that maybe the Indians used to tell their kids before bed kind of thing.
You know what I think is really fascinating and just is very ingratiating towards you writing this book is you started out with probably, it sounds like, not a lot of knowledge on Bigfoot and this subject. And it just puts a smile on my face to imagine as you're researching this book, it's almost a book within a book, right? You could write a book on the guy writing the book that you wrote, right? Because it's as like you said, the Da Vinci Code. You're discovering something, and as opposed to just this completely fictional story, you're just seeing a lot of dots get connected. I think it's a really interesting story on how you went about writing this book. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, that's a great point. I hadn't thought of it that way, probably because I'm too close to it. But, yeah, you're right. I mean, in a way, the novel as it is now is kind of my...
It's almost like an epiphany that you had, that as you're writing this piece of fiction, you thought, well, wait a second. This is going a little bit farther than what I anticipated.
Yeah, I was just going to tell a good old, yarn, and look at that. I've discovered something.
Exactly. And that would be, I mean, isn't that the fun part of as a kid, what is the one thing as a kid that you always want to stumble upon is, like you said, is a yarn or some tale that nobody else knows about, and you're actually discovering something that, and going back to another point you made, that other people just aren't seeing. And why is it that these other people aren't seeing it with the volume of, and while, admittedly, a lot of Sasquatch evidence is anecdotal, but as you said, when you add those up, there's so much anecdotal evidence that it starts to look like smoke, and where there's smoke, there's fire, right?
To ignore all the evidence that we have is ludicrous, but at the same time, to accept the reality without some kind of a specimen is ludicrous. So it's this cool dichotomy that I love. It's like,
it really is, yeah.
It's like, well, wait a minute, both of them can't be real.
Right. But everything can't be wrong and everything can't be right. So what in the heck is going on?
I forget who it was. Somebody was quoted as saying, if it just takes one eyewitness account to be true for the whole thing to be true. And I forget who it was, but that's exactly the point, is that they don't all have to be. I mean, obviously they're not all true. Not everybody saw what they're saying they saw.
Yeah, and I guess, that's the same that applies to, the footprint evidence. We only need one of the footprints to be true.
Yeah.
And I think I saw an episode of, even Les Stroud on Survivor Man kind of saying that as well. So, Eric, obviously your novel's been published some time. I believe it's been through, a couple iterations. And, along the way you stopped and you met some events and you talked to, different purported experts in the Sasquatch community. Just curious what the feedback was and how was it received?
Yeah, well, Lauren Coleman is probably the first one I should mention. So back in 2005, when it was initially published, that was around the time that Lauren Coleman was beginning he would make his own picks of the best crypto fiction of the year. So in 2005, I got this letter, or email. I think it was a letter back then, because I don't think email was all that prevalent in 2005. But he had selected on his own, come across my book somewhere, to be his top crypto fiction novel for 2005. And what was interesting is that one of the things that he commented about in the story was that it was it was like a Gigantopithecus documentary, in the sense that I laid out at least the time, the theory of Gigantopithecus in great detail. So anyone who wanted to know about Gigantopithecus and its connection to Sasquatch, it was all I know. And which was great for me to hear, because that's exactly what I was intending to do, was to lay that out with all the details, and people can make up their own minds afterwards. So hearing it from Lauren, who is obviously somebody who is very familiar with all of the theories of Sasquatch. And I've met Lauren at many conferences since then, and we have a good rapport. So for sure, he's well aware of Cryptid. I've had the opportunity at many Sasquatch conferences to talk with less famous but still infamous Sasquatch experts. Spent time at the Texas Bigfoot Conference and the sort of the southern contingent, the Pennsylvania crew. They have a group up in Pennsylvania, and especially those here in the Northwest, the Jeff Meldrums and those up here in the Washington and Idaho area. When you go to one Bigfoot conference, you tend to meet everybody because we all go to the same conferences. So having been to 3 or 4, maybe even more than that, I've had opportunity to meet with most of those who are still active in the endeavor.
So Eric, kind of what are your thoughts about, moving Cryptid to the big screen?
In the last couple of years, it's become a thing, if you will, for books to have trailers, like a movie would, but it's a trailer for the book. However, most of these trailers that books have are like still photo montages. I was one of the first to go out and actually shoot live dramatic scenes of the story of the book and then edit them together like you would a movie trailer. So it's interesting that I was attempting to create trailers like you would have of a movie without the movie. So I had to go select these various scenes of the book and shoot them like you would full on with a movie and then edit them together like a trailer.
Well, we think that you guys did a fantastic job talking up productions yourself. I mean, it's just absolutely great creative work. And for those out there listening, if you want to get behind the scenes on the Cryptid trailer, if you go out to Sasquatch Syndicate, we do have a free membership area. If you log in there, there's a lot of behind the scenes information and videos that Eric shared with us. So we're going to get those posted. But for now, let's sit back and enjoy the trailer for Cryptid.
My dear President Jefferson, I know your heart is right, and my loyalty is ever yours, but I can no longer endure.
In my father's village, they would call these fossils dragon teeth.
Except these aren't fossils. These are bones. They bury their dead.
I am tortured by that hunt.
You guys hear that?
Sounds pretty far off.
No, it's close. He's right there.
Positive ID on Silverback.
The devil is awake.
Unbelievable.
It's up to you now.
Let the citizens of this great nation learn the truth. The souls of men are not alone.
Well, I know that Paul and I, of course, loved it, and really congratulations to you and your team on such a successful release. So now that the book's finished, you've been through a couple iterations on the book. What are your plans for taking it to the big screen?
My ultimate goal is to see it in the big screen. I personally, as a lover of good fiction and monster stories and just good movies, I have to say that I have yet to see one good Bigfoot movie. They're all not very good.
You mean to tell me you didn't like Harry and the Hendersons?
Well, yeah, exactly. So when I began writing this story, I thought, one of the cool things would be maybe we could, for the first time, have a really good movie about Sasquatch, kind of like Jaws was about sharks. So my personal hope is that I can bring this to the big screen and finally show the audience what a good Sasquatch story would look like. I'm in the process of doing that. Hopefully the trailer can prove to those with the powers that be to help me make it happen. that's the intent of it anyway.
The difficulty is no one can envision what Sasquatch is because there's not really an actual picture. Other than the Patterson-Gimlin footage or maybe the Paul Freeman film, unless you subscribe to it being an ape theory, it's not going to work for your imagination. If you go into the relic hominid camp, that creature doesn't look like what they envision. If you believe it's an alien, you may not envision that as well. So it's so difficult without having one single photo or proof of evidence on what the creature looks like for it to go and be well taken. What was interesting recently, too, is when they shot the Avengers, it was the same, and I've heard this so many times, it's so similar shooting a Sasquatch movie as it is shooting the Incredible Hulk, because everybody has their kind of what the Hulk looks like based on what comic book you grew up with. What that character needs to look like. And Avengers 2 kind of hit the sweet spot of all the comic books when they recast it from Edward Norton. But it's just interesting that they make that parallel.
No, it's true.
Yeah, Eric, if you can go back, again, this is so fascinating to me. Can you go back and just tell our listeners what it was like the moment, as you're researching this book and you're trying to tie all these ends together. Can you tell us what it was like the moment that you realized there was something going on with this subject, right? You're creating a fictional book, right, based on some perhaps anecdotal accounts from the past, but what was it like? Explain what it was like when you just had this epiphany that there was something more to this than meets the eye. What was that like, and what was the piece of evidence or the story or the encounter that made you really sit and think, wow, there is really something more to this?
Ooh, that's good. That's a really good question, and I'll see if I can do it justice. I'm not sure I can pinpoint the exact moment, but I can remember the period of time in the research when that took place. It's weird how times have changed so fast, because when I was doing research on this book, a lot of it was in the library, which I don't do anymore, because you just Google everything. But I remember going to the library and collecting every book that I could find on the subject, which, impressively enough, there was quite a few. I had a stack. And I remember reading the story of, I think it was in the late 1800s, I guess you could call it a youth Sasquatch. There was an encounter where a young Sasquatch, I guess we'll call it, was captured and was put on a train in Canada to be taken somewhere, and he never showed up. I don't remember exactly what transpired, but it was an account from history, so we don't have anyone alive that we could talk to or anything about that. But it was an encounter that, number one, I had never heard anything like it before. It was very different than any of the other encounters. It's not usual for someone to talk about encountering a baby Sasquatch, for example. I remember there was that moment, probably around the same time I was going through the whole litany of Northwest Native American accounts. And I was totally ignorant of all that historic data. And I could certainly see where people could jump on the bandwagon, if you will, contemporarily since the Gimlin footage, and people can make up stories all they want. But for people to make up stories way back in the 1800s, when there was no social phenomenon, there was no subculture, there was no motivation to do so, it hit me like a ton of bricks that these guys didn't make this up. I mean, there's no reason to do that. These were documented historic accounts. Whether they were true or not, hard to say, but the documentation is accurate. It was kind of like when you're a kid and you maybe come to realize that Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny or something like that isn't what you thought it was. And your whole world in that moment completely changed. Like the foundation changed. Like, well, if that's possible, then what else is possible? What else did I think was true is potentially not true. It was a moment like that where you kind of question the foundation of reality in a certain way. I don't want to overplay that, obviously, but it's similar to that kind of a feeling.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. It's been a really good read, and I got to tell you, Eric, I think for me, one of the most fascinating parts of this is as you're doing this research and as you start getting a little bit curious and you look into it a little bit more, it is amazing how much information's out there. And another thing that's really fascinating to me is I wonder how many unreported sightings there are. So in other words, somebody's out in the woods, they see something, they have absolutely no frame of reference, similar to what, these trappers and woodsmen would be in the past. They had no frame of reference for that. And just dismiss it as a bear or, some other type of wildlife. Yeah, I think that was one of the most interesting parts of that.
I know for a fact, I have so many people I've talked to that would frame it in the terms of Sasquatch, but never would. Would never tell anybody, right? I mean, so there's a lot of people who see stuff that don't even talk about it. So whatever we have as a data point is probably a quarter of what actually exists.
So Eric, a couple questions. Obviously, this isn't your latest novel. Just curious, are you planning on doing a follow-up for Cryptid? And what are you working on these days?
There are those who've asked for a sequel to this book, and I probably will eventually one day write that. The final scene of Cryptid is a bit of a cliffhanger intentionally, and it does open the door for a sequel, but at the moment, I'm not working on that. I'm working on a trilogy. The book one of the trilogy is called Escape from Eden, and in this case, I'm kind of veering away from the whole cryptozoological realm a little bit, and I'm attempting to tell an alternate history of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. A little bit of a science fiction bent to it. The premise behind this is that Eden was actually a prison, and that Adam and Eve were wards, were the warden of the prison, if you will. And Lucifer was in this prison with all of his other cohorts, and something goes wrong, and Adam and Eve escapes from Eden into the world, into Earth. And our human history comes from this escape. And there's a whole trilogy based on this other world and other human histories that would have such prisons on planets like Earth.
What a great topic. I mean, it's just got an absolute wealth and depth in it that I don't think you could get anywhere else.
Yeah, it's an alternate. I want to write like an alternate history, but it's definitely fiction.
All right, well, this has been a fantastic hour. Again, Eric Penz, author of Cryptid, The Lost Legacy of Lewis and Clark. And for those that want to pick up a copy of the book, you can pick that up at SasquatchSyndicate.com under Book Club. So, Eric, thanks again for coming on Sasquatch Syndicate. We really do appreciate it, and I know our listeners do as well.
Thanks for sharing.
My pleasure. All right, talk to you soon.
This concludes our November 2016 podcast. Sasquatch Syndicate will return on Thursday, December 1st. Thanks to all our listeners and those who have been out to our website and those following us on social media. Sasquatch is a controversial subject, so for all the believers and disbelievers, and those that will tell you they have all the answers, just remember, we're flying through space at 700 miles per hour. Buckle up.